Before the sun rose over distant islands most Americans could not find on a map, young men from farms, factories, and city streets were already awake on rolling ships, staring at an endless ocean that would decide their fate, not knowing when land would appear, not knowing which morning would be their last, knowing only that the war was no longer far away, that the Pacific was not a backdrop but a battlefield, and that history was about to test them in silence, heat, fear, and patience, one island at a time, one decision at a time, in a war where survival itself became a daily mission. In December 1941, the Pacific Ocean suddenly became the center of America's future, not by choice, but by shock, when news of the attack on Pearl Harbor reached the mainland and transformed distant geopolitics into personal reality for millions of Americans. And within days, young men from farms, factories, and city streets lined up at recruiting offices, while families gathered around radios, hearing names like Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines spoken with urgency and disbelief as the United States declared war and prepared to fight an enemy thousands of miles away across water that seemed endless and unforgiving. A theater unlike Europe, with no ancient cities to liberate and no clear front lines, only islands scattered across the Pacific like stepping stones, each one holding airfields, harbors, and the promise of control over sea lanes that would determine the outcome of the war. And in early 1942, American soldiers, sailors, and Marines began arriving in places few had heard of before the war, places like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, where dense jungle replaced roads, heat replaced comfort, and time itself felt slower, heavier, as units struggled to adapt to an environment that tested their bodies and minds before the enemy ever appeared. Because the Pacific War was not only a contest of weapons and tactics, but of endurance, supply, and morale, where soldiers carried everything they needed on their backs, relied on uncertain supply lines stretched across oceans, and learned quickly that the jungle hid everything, including danger. And as Japanese forces advanced rapidly in the early months of 1942, capturing territory across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, American forces faced a reality that they were on the defensive, fighting to slow an enemy that seemed disciplined, determined, and deeply entrenched. And nowhere was this clearer than in the Philippines, where American and Filipino troops under General Douglas MacArthur resisted Japanese invasion forces with limited supplies, outdated equipment, and little hope of reinforcement, retreating to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor as food ran short and disease spread, until surrender became unavoidable in April and May of 1942, marking one of the darkest moments for American forces in the Pacific and a painful lesson in what this war would demand. While back in the United States, factories shifted to war production, training camps filled with recruits, and families adjusted to long separations measured not in weeks but in years. And as the U.S. Navy fought critical battles like Coral Sea and Midway in mid-1942, slowing and then halting Japanese expansion, American leaders began planning an offensive strategy built around island hopping, a method designed to bypass heavily defended positions, seize key islands, and move steadily closer to Japan itself, a strategy that placed enormous responsibility on the shoulders of ground troops who would have to land on hostile shores, secure airfields, and hold territory against determined resistance, often with little cover and no easy retreat. And the first major test of this approach came in August 1942 on Guadalcanal, where U.S. Marines landed under fire and entered a brutal campaign that lasted 6 months, fighting not just Japanese forces, but exhaustion, hunger, and constant uncertainty, as supply ships were threatened by enemy aircraft and naval forces, and soldiers lived for weeks at a time without knowing when relief would come, learning to sleep lightly, move quietly, and trust the men beside them completely. Because survival depended on teamwork and discipline more than individual heroics. And as the months passed and Guadalcanal was finally secured in February 1943, it became clear that victory in the Pacific would not come quickly or cheaply, but through a long series of battles that demanded patience and sacrifice. And with each new operation, American soldiers moved deeper into the Pacific, landing on islands like Tarawa, where the reality of amphibious assault shocked the nation, as initial waves faced unexpected obstacles and intense resistance, revealing how difficult it would be to seize even small pieces of land defended by an enemy prepared to fight to the last position. And yet, these battles also showed the growing strength and coordination of American forces, as lessons were learned, tactics improved, and cooperation between the Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Forces became more effective, gradually shifting momentum. And by 1944, American troops were advancing through the Marshall and Mariana Islands, capturing Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, islands that allowed long-range bombers to strike the Japanese home islands for the first time, bringing the war closer to its ultimate destination. While soldiers on the ground continued to face the daily realities of heat, isolation, and the psychological strain of combat in an environment where there were no front lines, only perimeter defenses and constant alertness. And for many soldiers, the Pacific War meant long stretches of waiting, broken by sudden moments of danger, writing letters home whenever possible, describing the weather, the scenery, and their longing for normal life, while leaving out the fear and fatigue they carried quietly, knowing their families were already worried enough. And as American forces prepared for the next major objective, the Philippines, the return promised by MacArthur became a symbol of both strategic necessity and personal redemption. And in October 1944, U.S. troops landed on Leyte, supported by one of the largest naval battles in history, marking the beginning of the liberation of the Philippines and the decisive shift in the Pacific War, as American soldiers once again fought on ground that had been lost early in the conflict, determined not to repeat the mistakes of 1942, pushing forward through difficult terrain and fierce resistance, aware that every mile gained brought them closer to Japan, but also deeper into a war that showed no signs of ending soon. And as 1945 approached, attention turned to islands even closer to the Japanese mainland, places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, whose capture was seen as essential for the final stages of the war. And American soldiers understood that these battles would be different, harder, and more costly than those before, because the enemy was defending territory viewed as a direct extension of their homeland. And as preparations were made, ships gathered, plans were finalized, and soldiers checked their gear in silence, many sensing that what lay ahead would test them beyond anything they had already endured. And as the first waves moved toward the shores of Iwo Jima in February 1945, under a gray sky and rising tension, the men could not know how long the battle would last or what it would demand, only that once they stepped onto that island, there would be no turning back. And as the ramps prepared to drop and the shoreline came into view, the Pacific War entered one of its most defining and uncertain moments, with the fate of thousands hanging on what would happen next. As the landing craft reached the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima in February 1945, American soldiers stepped into a battle that immediately defied every expectation formed from earlier island campaigns, because the island was silent at first. No immediate response, no visible movement, only Mount Suribachi rising at the southern end like a watchful presence. And then, without warning, the ground erupted with coordinated fire from hidden positions carved deep into the rock, revealing that the Japanese defenders had built an underground network designed to survive bombardment and strike with precision, forcing American units to advance yard by yard under constant pressure, learning quickly that taking ground was only the beginning, because every ridge, tunnel, and bunker had to be secured before moving forward. And days turned into weeks as soldiers adapted to a battle defined by patience, coordination, and resilience rather than speed. While far above them, the image of the American flag raised on Suribachi became a symbol of determination back home, even as fighting continued across the island long after the photograph was taken, reminding those on the ground that symbols did not end wars, people did. And when Iwo Jima was finally declared secured in March 1945, it had provided vital airfields for American aircraft, but at a cost that underscored how intense the final phase of the Pacific War would be. And that lesson became even clearer just weeks later on Okinawa, where American forces landed in April 1945 on an island larger and more populated than any they had faced before, an island intended to serve as a staging ground for a potential invasion of Japan itself. And from the beginning, the battle unfolded differently, with Japanese forces drawing American troops inland, using terrain and weather to their advantage, turning the campaign into a prolonged struggle marked by heavy rain, difficult movement, and constant strain, while soldiers endured long periods in defensive positions, rotating units forward and back as fatigue accumulated. And as weeks passed, the psychological toll became just as significant as the physical demands, because Okinawa was not only a battlefield but a home to civilians caught between two armies, adding complexity and emotional weight to every decision. And as American troops advanced, they faced an enemy determined to slow them at every opportunity. Knowing that time itself was a weapon, and at sea the U.S. Navy faced persistent threats from air attacks that tested the endurance of sailors and pilots alike, reinforcing the sense that the closer the war moved toward Japan, the more intense and costly it became. And by June 1945, Okinawa was secured, but the scale of the battle forced American leaders to confront a difficult question: how much more sacrifice would be required to end the war? Because intelligence estimates suggested that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would result in unprecedented losses on both sides. And as soldiers rested briefly, many sensed that something decisive was approaching, even if they did not know what form it would take. And while troops continued training and repositioning across the Pacific, events far from the front lines began to shape the war's final chapter, as American scientists completed work on a new weapon developed under the Manhattan Project, a weapon intended to force a swift conclusion to a conflict that had already consumed years and countless lives. And in August 1945, that weapon was used against Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, shocking the world and altering the course of history. And within days, Japan announced its intention to surrender, bringing an abrupt end to the fighting that many soldiers had feared would continue indefinitely. And across the Pacific, American troops received the news with disbelief, relief, and quiet reflection, because the war that had defined their daily existence was suddenly over, and the transition from combat to peace was not immediate or simple, as soldiers remained overseas to occupy former enemy territory, assist with rebuilding, and ensure stability, witnessing firsthand the aftermath of a war that had reshaped nations and societies. And when Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in September 1945, it marked the official end of World War II and closed the Pacific chapter that had begun with surprise and uncertainty nearly 4 years earlier. And as American soldiers gradually returned home, they carried with them experiences that would shape the rest of their lives: memories of distant islands, intense heat, long nights, and bonds formed under pressure. And their return transformed communities across the United States as families reunited and the nation adjusted to peace, even as the legacy of the Pacific War continued to influence military strategy, foreign policy, and collective memory, because the story of American soldiers in the Pacific was not only about battles won or territory gained, but about endurance across vast distances, adaptation to unfamiliar environments, and the willingness of ordinary individuals to face extraordinary challenges. And long after the last shots were fired, the lessons of that war remained, etched into history by those who crossed an ocean and changed the course of the 20th century.